Right here I got 3 angle kits that are probably one of the more common ways of getting angle on your car. These specifically are for the BRZ because that's what I have, but the method that they kind of use to get angle on the car is pretty common for any car. The different companies that make these parts specifically are also making it for other cars, so it's not just the BRZ, and all these other parts are similar, obviously just shaped a little different to work on different cars. Now these kits are more on the basic side. You're probably not going to see this on some professional car. I mean, you can, just depends on how complicated the person wants to go with the adjustability on their car. So as you can see, the 3 different kits over here, this is obviously just one side. There's going to be a left and right for each, but you can see it's a small kit that just fits on my desk. You can get bigger kits like from FDF that are complete replacements of almost every arm on your car, but these are probably the more common ones you'll see most casual people will have, or people who just want to keep a more simple or cheaper build. And I thought I'll make this video just to kind of show a comparison of how these work and also roughly how much they cost to do. All these 3 over here all have the same basic goal of trying to get your wheels to turn more than stock. Like I said, all of this is for a BRZ, but the only exception is this part right here. So this tie rod is actually not for a BRZ. I'm just using this as an example because I don't actually have BRZ tie rod with me, so this is just an example, but I'll just explain how it works. I'm going to start over here with this full knuckle, as you can see. So this is where your front wheel would bolt on. My struts go here. This is for the caliper, lower control arm, and then my outer tie rod. So this right here is from Unicorn Knuckles. Hopefully I'm saying that right. I'll put a link for all of them below. So this right here is a stock BRZ knuckle. So this is what your car would have. The only thing that's done to it, if I come down here, if you can see, these are actually some welds here. Originally, the stock placement for this hole would have been out here. And what they would have done is cut a chunk of metal out of here and then move this piece and weld it over here. And the way this works, so pretend this is now the stock location of the tie rod. And if you turn your wheel to the car, your knuckle turns like that. Say for example you move your outer tie rod 1 inch up, that's how much your knuckle or your wheel turns. If you bring this back and now move your tie rod closer to the center, now if you push that tie rod the same 1 inch, it actually turns the knuckle way more. So, but this is what the Unicorn Knuckles do for you if you send them your knuckles. The other thing you can actually do with these is instead of actually cutting it and re-welding it, you can also leave this section just the stock length, and instead of cutting the original hole and moving it, you can just re-drill a new hole. Next up over here I have the GKTech angle kit. So what this does is the same thing as this, where it moves the outer tie rod location closer to the center of the knuckle. The main difference is that instead of cutting and modifying your stock knuckle, all this does is takes this bracket right here, you bolt it onto a stock knuckle. So this hole over here goes between your lower control arm, and this hole here, hole where this bolt is in, and it would go in the original stock outer tie rod location. And so now what happens when this is the original stock location, now this becomes your outer tie rod, and you just basically replace your stock outer tie rod, and now it's moved from here to here. So it does the same thing of moving that location, except here you get a different tie rod and you get a bracket, so you don't actually permanently modify your whole knuckle. Finally down here you can see this is quite the simplest of the kits. This one can literally be as simple as just this piece of washer right here. So you just imagine this is your stock inner tie rod. You take this, you literally put it on this end. This is the end that would screw on into your steering rack. This is where your outer tie rod would be. And now what happens is that once you screw this into your rack, this spacer is here, and what it does is that basically the thickness of this spacer is how much extra travel that your steering rack will be able to do. Now, like I said before, this is just a random tie rod and a random washer I found that fit. If you were to actually buy a washer from a company that made these washers specifically for your car, it probably would fit a little better, but this is just to give you an idea of what you would do. Now, the main difference of how this works versus both of these two is that instead of making your kind of knuckle geometry a little different there, now your steering rack actually travels a little more. Now the other variation to this is that there are some companies that make an entire inner tie rod replacement with this washer basically kind of machined on and built in, so you don't have to put like a loose washer on your tie rod. You'll just get a full tie rod with this kind of extra piece of metal already sticking out. The good thing about that is that over here, as you can tell, once you put the washer, you lose a bit of these threads. So once you install it back into your steering rack, you're technically losing some of that thread engagement. The aftermarket companies that make the built-in one will probably also extend your thread length so that you have the same amount again. So hopefully I covered the generic idea of how these work so you have an idea. You could probably also look up other videos of people actually installing and using and driving with these, so it just makes a little more sense. But now I'm going to go through kind of pros and cons of using each of these. First thing to compare is the installation of these. So some of you may not want the most complicated kit. Some of these are a little more easier to install yourself if that's what you're trying to do. Now with the knuckle, obviously it's an entire knuckle. So what you're going to have to do, unbolt everything from the knuckle. So lower control arm, tie rods, your brake calipers, rotors, and your strut. Now this is going to be different for different cars because not all cars have the same things attached to the knuckle. So depending on how many stuff you have attached to your knuckle, you're gonna have to remove everything and you're replacing an entire knuckle. The other little quirk, if you will, with this is that you do have to replace either your outer tie rod or your inner tie rod to kind of adjust for the fact that you move this location, because by moving this you actually move the hole further out, and so the overall length of your inner and outer tie rod do have to be increased. So most people increase the inner tie rod, and what they get is actually this one over here. So that's why I said this is not an actual BRZ tie rod. This is actually for Eclipse, if I remember. I forgot what year, like the older ones though. And what this is that it's the exact same threads as a BRZ on both ends. So it bolts on the same, except the overall length is a bit longer. So that offsets the fact that you move the hole. Some people also use a different outer tie rod. I forgot what car it's from, but I think it was from a Hyundai, but it's basically the same thing where the threads and the taper is the same, but the length is a bit longer. So you do have to do that too. So if you buy this knuckle from Unicorn Knuckles, I think the last time I checked their website, they do include this extended tie rod. Now the other thing is, if you're trying to use your knuckle that's on your car, you're obviously going to have to remove this. And I mean, if you know how to weld yourself and take the measurements properly, you can do this yourself. Or if you have to send it out to someone to do, your car's going to be stuck with no knuckle for a while. And if you need to drive your car in that time, that might be an issue. So out of all the three, I would say this is the most work intensive, just because of how many parts you have to undo and redo on the car. Next up is the GKTech kit. This is kind of similar to this in a sense that you have to unbolt stuff from the knuckle, but you don't have to do the struts, or I don't think, I did have to do the caliper in this case because you have to take off the brake shield. This section over here, if I remember correctly, does touch it. So you either have to take it out or you have to cut a slot in it. So with this, you'll be taking out the lower control arm, the tie rod from here, and the dust shield. Like I mentioned for the knuckle, where you needed an extended inner or outer tie rod, with this, you technically need the same thing because you're moving the hole again, except here they come with this Heim joint over here, which is adjustable. So if you just unscrew this, it basically lengthens, and that's how you're going to offset the movement of the hole. So over here, what you're going to have to do is just take out the inner tie rod. So if you're using the spacer, you have to take it out and reinstall your stock tie rod. I would say, honestly, in my opinion, this is probably worse than that, because I find it harder to kind of deal with inner tie rods rather than everything that's up front. Kind of depends how you see it. This might be less work for some people because you're undoing a little less, just going deeper into the car to actually get to the inner tie rod. But in this case, that's pretty much all you have to do. Next up is the cost. Obviously, that's going to be one of the bigger factors. Over here on the knuckles, this obviously will vary with who you do it or if you know how to do this yourself. But just for example, this actually costs $740 if you just get an entire knuckle from them. You do have the option of sending in your stock one as a core charge, and it'll drop down the price to $440. So those are the prices at the moment of making this video. I think it used to be a little different, but with this you do also get this tie rod, which you will need included with it as well. The GKTech kit is coming in at $309, so it is slightly cheaper than this. And finally, to the cheapest option. So this will depend on if you're going with the washer or entire tie rod replacement. So if you're going with the washer, this is a little hard to price out, because I mean, you can kind of really get any washer that has the right dimensions to fit, and I mean, you could probably find that for like a couple cents, $1 or whatever. And there's some companies that do sell washers, which I've seen from like 15, 30, maybe even more dollars, just how much they really want to charge you. And then if you want to get one with the built-in kind of spacer, the whole tie rod I've seen go for around $100 for the BRZ at least, making inner tie rods, which are probably the most popular ones for the BRZ. Now talking about the actual increase of angle you get with these kits. With the Unicorn Knuckle, they advertise a total angle of 60 degrees, about 60 degrees. It's not exact, but about 60 degrees. Can vary depending on your setup, but I guess 60 is the max you can probably get out of this, is what they're trying to say. Another thing that's included with this is actually this washer, if I remember correctly. I think currently on their website it did say that this washer comes with it, so you'll get this plus the increased angle that you get from this. I haven't actually driven with this yet on my car. I will be putting it on my car soon, and I won't be using this because the more angle you have, the more kind of rubbing issues you usually have on most cars. So I will be running without it, but I think they do include this, which I forgot to mention earlier. Coming over to this one is actually the exact same thing. So this also claims about 60 degrees as well. Like I said, they're doing the same thing physically, just in slightly different ways. So they're both moving that hole and probably in the exact same distance as well. So that's probably why this kit is getting you about the same amount of angle as that one. And while this kit doesn't include the spacer, technically you could also combine this kit with this as well. Finally, coming to this one, so this was the cheapest and it does unfortunately give you the lowest amount of angle. This, I'm honestly not sure what real angles you get from this. My guess is like maybe 5 degrees of increase, maybe 10, but I think 10 is kind of stretching it. Next up is your steering wheel rotation. This might not really be a big deal, but I thought I'd mention it. So with both of these two kits, what happens is your steering wheel will actually turn the exact same number of times as stock. So if your stock wheel turns a rotation of 2 times, once you put these kits on, it'll be the same thing. But with this over here, because you're increasing the steering rack travel, if your stock car wheel turns 2 times, this might actually increase it to 2.5 times. I mean, you could either see that as a positive or a negative, but this one you will technically have to turn your wheel a little extra to get the angle out of it. Another thing with your steering is these two again are similar in the fact that they both increase the speed of your turning. So say you turn your steering wheel 90 degrees, stock, your wheel will say turn this much, but now with the kit on, if you turn your wheel 90 degrees, your actual wheels might actually turn way more. So with this one, it's going to stay the exact same speed. These could actually be really nice for even just normal racing. So you don't have to turn your wheel as much to get the same amount of turn. So you could probably take a full U-turn without having to take your hands off the wheel and, you know, reposition it. Next thing I want to talk about is Ackerman. That's not something I really mess with. I know what it is, but I really don't think about it too much. You can probably look up another video on explaining the exact science between that, but on a basic level, it's just the difference in the wheel angle between your left and right wheel, because they're actually not the same when you turn the wheel. On the cut knuckles over here, just on the Drift Knuckles website, it actually says that it reduces Ackerman. By how much, I'm not really sure, but it reduces it, which means that your left and right wheels are going to be more similar in angle, which is better for drifting, but it is worse for daily driving. On this kit here, you actually have 2 options, which lets you kind of adjust between high and low Ackerman. I forgot if the higher or lower is closer to stock. I'm assuming the higher one is, but what you can do to adjust the Ackerman on this kit is, so the center is this bolt over here, undo, and then you see this here, this comes out, and if you see the shape of this hole, it's actually not a full circle, because you can either put it this way, where this hole is slightly tilted to this side, or you can flip it, rotate it 100 degrees, and now the hole is closer to this side. So that small change actually increases and decreases Ackerman. Kind of forgot which way is the higher side, but you kind of have that adjustability over here. The other thing you can actually adjust on this kit as well, with the spacers over here on this kit, there are 2 that come with this kit, and what you can do, you get 2 of these. You could either place both the top, both the bottom, or one on top and bottom to change the height of your outer tie rod. And I think that really matters if your car is lowered. It usually changes the angle of your tie rod, and that induces bump steer. And with this one, there's no adjustability and it doesn't change your Ackerman. Talking about the tie rods next. So again, with this one, I mentioned that you do need to get an extended tie rod on this end to compensate for the change in the hole. Over here, you can just adjust this tie rod, and you don't have to buy anything longer. And with this one, you're using all stock stuff, or if you're buying a full replacement, you just have to replace that. The other difference you gotta consider is that both of these will use OEM style tie rods, mainly with the outer tie rod. So I don't have an example of a stock outer tie rod, but you can see with this one is actually a Heim joint. So this one does come with a boot, so which I did use. Some people don't use it, but it's hard to tell, but if you Google Heim joints, you'll see what kind of joint this is. The good thing about this is that it has very high swing angles, so it is very adjustable. It fits a lot of kind of applications, and it is a lot cheaper. The downside of this, in my opinion at least, some people don't care, but because I daily drive this car, because of how the joint is designed and how the sphere is very exposed, these don't really last that long because dirt, dust, whatever gets into the sphere that's over here and basically wears it down. But if you look at a lot of aftermarket adjustable, even control arms, their ball joints and even bushings are replaced by Heim joints because they're just really adjustable. They fit a lot of applications and just easier to use. It's just that they don't last as long. In both cases here, you're using the stock outer tie rod, which has a fully sealed boot, and everything is kind of closed in and has a lot less chance of wearing out. However, the good thing about these Heim joints is that they're very cheap. So if yours does wear out, you can buy them for, I'm pretty sure, under $20. Maybe slightly more around there, depending where you get it from. But GKTech does sell replacements. As per the feel of daily driving any of these, they feel fairly normal. I daily drove this in between actually drift events, taking it to work. And I've driven this for like a whole summer, so it's still pretty good. It's not like you're replacing it every event or something. It's just more often than an OEM tie rod would be. Another downside to the kit is that you have to use their nuts. So you can't use the OEM castle nuts anymore. At least in my opinion, I'm not a fan of that. In this case, you do have to also use thread locker to make sure that these nuts don't come out from the vibrations. On a castle nut, you got the cotter pin that stops that from happening. And even then, I did have to retorque these nuts after drifting with them. The reason that they switched to these nuts is because the castle nuts will no longer fit. And these nuts are not specific to this kit. So because of how solid everything in the aftermarket components are, a lot of times you do have to retorque all the nuts, and it's just one more thing you got to keep in mind. Last thing I want to talk about is durability slash failure points. All of these parts is all kind of proven stuff. This one you can still buy proven stuff. Like I said, mine is just some random pieces thrown together. But all of these are, you know, available from companies that have, you know, tried and tested these. You won't see too many failures from this. There's an exception to this one over here because the kit I have here is the first version of this kit. They are currently on the third version, so there have been improvements since I bought the initial release over here. There was some issues with some people's brackets bending. Fortunately, nothing ever happened to mine. As you can see, it's still fine, but some people had issues, so they have strengthened it. You know, that issue is taken care of. On this one, again, it's a proven method of cutting and welding, so probably won't happen. But in this case, the weak link would be the weld. That's the only thing that can really break. The rest of it is stock, so you can, you know, safely assume that it's still good. And in this case, where you're adding extra travel to your steering rack, the only thing I would really consider is the fact that you're kind of stressing out your steering rack a bit more. So either your electric motor or your hydraulic pump is going to be having to work a little bit more. The general consensus is that when you do stuff like this, probably is a little more wear and tear. The other thing is the fact that if you're going with the washer method, you are reducing your thread, so you are also having less thread engagement there. So if you put too big of a washer and take out all this thread, you might have this thing just strip out. But all those issues should be refined and calculated for if you're buying these from reputable companies. So that's pretty much it. I think I covered most of it. Hopefully gave you a good general and fairly detailed idea of what you're getting into when you're choosing between a couple different angle kits. If there are any added points worth mentioning, or if I misspoke about anything, let me know. Otherwise, if there's questions, I will try to answer them as best as I can.